really, should I speak? Okay. It's really great to, is it on? Hello? Yes.
No.
It's really great to know everyone likes a party because, welcome. And thank you so much, Daniel and Peter, for coming tonight. It's just a fun, wonderful, heartwarming book, and it's great to have you both here to talk about it. I'm going to read the bio, even though everyone knows everyone. Well, you might not know Peter, but I always love reading the bios because there are things that you don't know, and I did actually learn something about you, Daniel, in this. So D.T. Max, Daniel, is a staff writer at The New Yorker, and his book, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story, which is the life of David Foster Wallace, was a New York Times bestseller. He's also the author of The Family That Couldn't Sleep, a medical mystery, which the New York Times book review called gripping, cleanly written, cannily plotted, and elegantly educational. And he has been the books editor of the New York Observer, a writer for the New York Times Magazine, a pseudonymous really bad food reviewer for the paper, which I did not know. And he contributed the afterword in the New York Review of Books Classics reissue of William McPherson's 1984 novel, Testing the Current. He lives in New Jersey, Montclair.
You actually don't have the up-to-date bio, not that it matters. It describes me as a long-time resident of Montclair.
Yes. A
10 years, you
resident.
get your badge.
With your 2 children and a rescue dachshund cocker mix named Nemo. So thank you, Daniel, for coming tonight to share this book with us. And in conversation, we were very excited to welcome Peter Flynn. He's a New York-based award-winning director, writer, and educator, and an associate professor in musical theater at Montclair State University. And he recently directed Eyes of the World, a multimedia symphonic performance at Carnegie Hall.
It's on the hill.
It's on the hill.
It's the north part of New York.
and the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And his many New York credits include Chess with Josh Groban and Sutton Foster, Funny Girl with Whoopi Goldberg, etc. I can't read them all, but you also created and directed 6 original award-winning productions for TheaterWorks, the National Children's Touring Company, and is currently preparing to direct a new musical, Calling Us Home, in Cape Town, South Africa. And you are the board president for a not-for-profit theater organization, Live in Color, and is an associate artist at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and you also personally have met Sondheim.
I have.
So that adds to this whole wonderful conversation.
And I'm an original resident of Montclair
Oh,
as well.
there you go.
Born and bred, Lower Montclair.
You
Beautiful place.
We always bring them back. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Daniel, for coming tonight and sharing your wonderful book with us. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
So, hi everybody, welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. Daniel, it's so great to be with you and meet you in person after reading your book. It was so engaging from a very different point of view from mine, not only knowing Mr. Sondheim, but also being from a theatrical creative point of view. So I want to talk about that more, but you have part of it you'd like to read.
I do, and Margot, thank you, and Catherine. Watchung Books has been a second home to me. Probably an exaggeration, but I do like to come here a lot. Terrific bookstore, absolute cornerstone of our amazing town. And I also want to thank Cherry Provost, who actually created the bar mitzvah-worthy spread. Thank you, Cherry. I knew when I called you and acted desperate that you would rescue. I suggested peanuts. So I'm just going to read you the beginning, which kind of will answer the question of how and why. And then Peter and I will pick it up from there. So I always wanted to write about Stephen Sondheim. Actually, long before writing about him was a possibility, I just wanted to meet Stephen Sondheim. In the spring of 1977, when I was 15, my mother went to a benefit for a theater. The event included a performance of Side by Side by Sondheim, which was a review of Sondheim's songs. She came home with a 2-record album of the show, and it was signed by Hal Prince, the artistic director of the theater, in magic marker, and below that was Sondheim's signature, in a more delicate hand, his S's like 2 treble clefs. I'd never seen a signed book or album before. I didn't even know that people did that. On the cover, Sondheim in profile glared off into space, and behind him hovered the logos for his many musicals. 9 amazing shows already, and he was still only in his mid-40s. His imposing body language, chin up, arms crossed, seemed to promise that more were definitely on the way. So my family lived in a large Upper West Side apartment. Actually, Peter and I have exchanged places in the world. I wish you this apartment. My parents agreed on very little. And as a result, many rooms had almost no furniture. But in our living room, there stood a gorgeous walnut-paneled KLH Model 20 Plus stereo. My father, a lawyer, would put Dave Brubeck's Take 5, a favorite of his, on the spindle, and down the disc would drop with a click. So if you pulled the throw arm over to the side, a record would play over and over. And that's exactly what my father did. But every once in a while, my mother, or maybe it was in fact me, would put one of the Sondheim records on the spindle and let that drop instead. It was a different sort of sound that would now fill the living room, spinning on top of the gyrating pile. I soon understood that Sondheim's witty, intricate songs were special. True, they weren't as singable, and definitely not as whistleable as other songs. And his characters didn't sing to express overwhelming emotions or resolve simple doubts. Instead, Sondheim's characters were made of doubt, of missteps, of ambivalence. Marry me a little, side by side by side. The complexity extended to the music itself, which Sondheim filled with tricky rhythms and harmonic improbabilities. Several songs on the album were from the musical company, and that group of arch, insecure, promiscuous frenemies, they struck me as perhaps what life was really like. Even in my mid-teens, I guessed that Sondheim's music captured perfectly the New York that I was growing up in, with its graffiti-filled subways and its pot-filled parties, its uncertain adults and its adult children. So over the next 4 decades, and I've never got over my sense of having a special connection to Sondheim that he was in some way actually writing for me. Then in late 2016, I saw his name on a list of possible profile subjects at the New Yorker where I was writing. Apparently, the composer and lyricist had a new musical coming out based on 2 movies by the surrealist director Luis Buñuel. Now this sounded absolutely too good to be true. Buñuel was a director I loved. And then there was the Sondheim part. So now the opportunity was obviously appealing, but I wasn't sure actually in truth how much fun it would be, because to the extent I knew anything about Sondheim's public persona at this point, his reputation in truth was that of someone who guarded his privacy carefully. So much so that in 1998, when he was nearly 70, the fact that he spoke with some candor about his homosexuality was treated as some sort of revelation by the press. To be sure, I could see why he might be mistrustful of the press. I mean, even into the 1990s, many serious critics, including some who admired or said they admired his overall goals, had mixed feelings about his work. It's true, if you go back and look at the reviews, you keep wondering where is this moment where Sondheim was declared a genius, because they just would beat him up constantly. Or at least they gave him suggestions on the second act, which came to the same. In the end, of course, Sondheim outlasted those critics. A new generation grew up who embraced his work without reserve. To them, everything before Sondheim in musical theater was dated and kitschy. And those works created in their own time, if they were any good, owed an obvious debt to him. Here's an example from Lin-Manuel Miranda a couple of months after Sondheim's death in November of 2021. He said, "Anyone who tells you that Sondheim isn't an influence on their music or their work is simply lying." But that was the triumphant end. The trip through the woods had surely taken its toll. Over time, he developed a public persona that was brassy and comic. He was happy to talk, but he often kept things impersonal. But still, it seemed worth a shot. So I wrote an email to Sondheim's assistant to ask if the composer-lyricist would be willing to be profiled by me. Not long afterwards, Sondheim gave his straightforward response in a direct email. "Dear Daniel, if I may," he began, and signed off yours, Steve S. Yes, he would be happy to sit for a portrait if I was interested. Not that the note was without guile, and in fact, if it had been, I'd have been a bit disappointed. Example, he wrote that he was flattered to be asked. Now that just sounded ridiculous. I mean, given that he'd by then won 8 Tonys, 8 Grammys, and a Presidential Medal of Freedom, and had a Broadway theater named after him. But I sent him a copy of the biography of David Foster Wallace I'd published a few years before. He responded soon after that the first sentence in my book reminded him of a first sentence he had just read in a memoir in that week's New Yorker, which on one hand was sort of flattering, right? But he did not say if he got beyond that first sentence, or like the rest in either case. But when I offered a date to meet, he accepted, so apparently I had passed some sort of audition, or so I thought. As I got ready for the first interview, I realized that despite decades of admiring his work, I could not remember even the most basic things about him. I did not know where he was born, where he grew up. I didn't know how he began his career. I didn't know who his friends were, where he lived. I didn't know what he looked like now, that he was an old man, or how he spoke. I didn't know if he composed on a piano or in the bathtub, which of his musicals he loved best, or whether the words came first to the music, although I did remember a quip from Merrily We Roll Along when somebody asked somebody in that musical the exact question, and he answers, the contract. I did not know if he had siblings or a partner, an ex, hobbies, pets, vacation homes, secrets. I thought about my ignorance, and I asked myself if it would irritate him. But I didn't think so. I would explain that there were 3 or 4 songs of his that were so familiar to me I couldn't remember when I'd first heard them. These songs had changed in my life. I wasn't trying to be a critic, and I wasn't trying to be a maven. He probably had enough of these. I was just a listener. One thing I strongly suspected was that Sondheim wasn't waiting for any critiques that I might have to offer anyway. He would want to be in control of the discussion, the goal of which would be, ultimately, no doubt, to tutor me. I hoped I would be able to push him just far enough out of his routine to get a fresh glimpse of who he was. To do this, I wasn't going to try to impress him. It might be nice that I liked puzzles and rhymes, as I knew he did, but he had, I presumed, access to the conversation of the most remarkable people on the planet, so really, why did he need mine? These thoughts were just guesses anyway, and doubtless they left out a lot. In the end, I would just try to have a conversation, much like 2 people who happen to sit next to each other on a flight and don't quickly come to wish it was shorter, or who are seated together at a wedding because the marrying couple thought they might have something in common. I wanted what took place between us to be humble, unremarkable, non-interviewee. One thing I had in my favor was that he was old now. It might be time for a new openness from him. The Sondheim in my profile would in many ways be familiar, of course, because how could it not be? But it was possible, too, that in this most reflective time of life, he may come out a bit more nuanced, a bit more complex, a bit more Sondheimian. So one day, in January 2017, I stood in front of a series of low-connected houses in the East 40s. The word Masonette was going through my head. What were the possible rhymes? Red Corvette, Press Gazette, Raisinette. It was January, but mild, evening time, pink sunset. I walked down a few stairs and rang an unmarked doorbell, phone rings, door chimes, and in went me, directly into a living room like an old stage set.
So great. And I love that there were tickles of laughter at a Sondheim lyric. That's very important in this crowd, so that's great. Daniel, your book is really just so terrific and engaging in such an easy way. And part of the reason I was so grateful to have this conversation with you is it's really the polar opposite of my experience, which is what was so compelling, and it's what I'd like to start our conversation with. And since it is a conversation, if anybody has questions throughout, feel free to raise your hand and ask, and we'll just include you, and we'll certainly have time at the end too. So I'm a stage director, as I was introduced, and my first time that I met Sondheim was when my writing partner of a show that I was writing the script for said, "Hey, can I bring a friend to the reading of our show?" The very first time we were hearing it out loud. It was very informal in a friend's living room. We were going to cook supper and then hear it out loud. I said, "Sure, who is it?" He said, "Steve Sondheim." And so you can imagine, you know, what's interesting is when you were saying I didn't know anything about him, where he went to school, if he liked to write, and of course I was like, Williams College, I grew up in New York, you know, like I'd done my Sondheim fileness. And so ever since that moment when I met him, and he was terrific, you know, at the intermission of our informal reading, he grabbed myself and my writing partner and walked into the garden and said, "So what's next? Here are the questions I have." And it was really engaging and intimidating at the same time. So I give that as all preface because my relationship with Steve is always one of veneration and honor and admiration. if not intimidation. And you really, like you say in your preface, you come not as a critic or a maven, but really as a listener. And so because of that, I was really impressed, if not astonished, at how gutsy you were in the questions you asked him. You really, it was just a simple conversation between people, but I must have circled a dozen different ones and just wrote, never would ask that. And so that's the first thing I like to hear about, but in context with that, in connection with that, is also what I don't know if anybody knows is it wasn't just a conversation that took place in 2017. It's a conversation that went on off and on for 3.5 years, right? That where Sondheim would say, okay, that's enough. And then you'd have the tenacity and the awesome strength to say, hey, I'm going to pick up the phone or the email and I'm going to write back and get him back into an interview. And you did that 5 times by my count, 5 or 6 times.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, let me try and answer the questions and at the same time put a number on it. I mean, what I felt all along. Is this not on? Up?
Yeah.
Down? Down?
There you
All
go.
right. What I remember it slightly differently. I don't remember it as just me pursuing him. I remember or felt like every time we would move forward with this profile, and a New Yorker profile can take 10 visits. I mean, not unusual for it to go on for a couple of years, but every time we would get somewhere, he would bring up something that would prohibit us from going forward. So there are 5 sections of the book because we did 5 interviews. But like on the first one, I walked in with this setup that I'd given you, and it turned out that actually, although he had written me that we were going to start the profile, it turned out we were actually going to have another audition, in effect, which is a very, very enjoyable section, at least for me, in some ways the most enjoyable section of the book on rereading, because we talk about everything but really his art. So we talk a lot about like his favorite movie, and he loves this stuff. So for instance, he says, what's your favorite John Ford movie? It turns out he was a reader, but a weirdly idiosyncratic reader. That was first surprise, you'd think a guy who could write that way had read everything, but in fact he kind of prided himself on not reading almost anything and saying he really didn't have the patience or the brain to read it, that he would just read summaries of things. Well, possibly true, though he sure knew a lot from the summaries. But anyway, so he would say, favorite John Ford movie, and I'd go, The Searchers, and he'd say, it's so overrated. And I would go, then I'm leaving. And he'd say, I didn't say it was bad, I just said it's overrated. I'd say, what's yours? He said, Grapes of Wrath. I said, you couldn't pay me to watch that thing again. So we had a weird kind of cultural gymnastics going on. And I guess, I didn't think it really required anything more than, I thought he was enjoying it. I mean, I thought, despite saying he had access to the conversation of everyone in the universe, although that's true, I'm not sure that on a daily basis kept him entirely. He liked to meet people. Sondheim throughout his life, like your story, he didn't want to stay in his little cave. In some way, he always was curious. And that's not typical in my experience of very, very well-known people tend to become frightened by their fame. They don't like the chance encounters. They don't know what they'll hold. On the one hand, they could be truly brutal. On the other hand, it's also they could just confirm, let's say, their own uncertainty about whether they really deserve all this adulation. So Steve, or as you call him Steve, I really call him Sondheim. For me, Sondheim wasn't immune to that. Because, the second section were to pen the writers' groups, the big dinner in black tie, and that's if you get a chance to look at the author photo, it's the only author photo. It's a photo of him and me at this dinner.
I wondered when I saw it.
Yeah, and it's the only author photo where you can't see the face of the author.
The subject is loud and clear.
Yeah. It's sort of meant to symbolize, like, I'm taking notes. He's doing the talking. But he had I call it almost kind of third affect, like not, so I think he went a little too far in that first email with that kind of, I'd be flattered. Let's be honest, right? But on the other hand, I do think I brought something to him that he enjoyed. And then I think every so often he looked back, and so there's a simultaneous story here, which is he's working on the Buñuel Buñuel musical, and is not going well. So it's hard to know what that means from anyone, right? I mean, you can tell me your book's not going well. I could tell you my book's not going well. You know, I see Garth back there. His book's not going well. And Sandy's book's not. Very few people. You don't want the evil eye in you, so you're generally going to talk about your book not going well. But I did think that on some level, he was beginning to feel it was beyond him to do this. Not probably from a technical point of view, but from an emotional and just from a just an emotional point of view. Like the enormous desire you have to create something as complicated as a musical was just kind of beginning to, I mean, he was 87, he's 86 when I meet him. I think he's 90 the last time I see him. You know, that's an extraordinary age to be as nimble as he was, as fast. I mean, he wasn't like most people as they grow older. You know, they say that crossword puzzles are supposed to keep your brain young, and if that's true, you know, it worked for him, because I mean, I did a little bit of sort of snooping 101, and I was up in his bathroom because I really did have to go. And I saw it was like he had several crossword puzzles book open for doing on the Johnny. So clearly, like, even at 87, he still loved the word games. But I do think I gave him something. Again, I'm not overstating what I gave him. I'm not saying that Sondheim's biography or life would be radically different if we erased this character, 1 hour and 34 minutes into the movie. I mean, I get that he was surrounded by extraordinary people and extraordinary moments, that he had created some of the most remarkable works that I've ever heard, and that, legacy will, I hope, last, although I think he had some doubts about it, and that was one of the reasons he couldn't keep creating. But anyway, so that's why I had the courage, because I didn't actually feel that way, and that's partly a tribute to him, I think.
I agree, yeah.
Partly a tribute to the fact that the second I would sit down in his townhouse, a glass of wine would be brought to me. So you had no moment of just pure, ontological terror as you sat there with Stephen Sondheim. You were in the dentist chair and they give you a little chloroform. And then 3, I mean, I do think that part of my work involves at least some small toughening of the exterior, not so much so that you can't do what you want to do, but enough so that you don't run at the first sign that this isn't as pleasant as being at home in Montclair, with Netflix and Nemo the mixed dachshund. Although actually it does say Pomeranian. Margot didn't read the revised. In the revised thing, Nemo had upgraded himself to a Dachshund Pomeranian mix, which he's very proud of, but whatever. Late ads never get into pieces. Anyway, that's my slight, but I'm very interested about what you said. So, what did he tell you in the garden?
He basically.
And what year? Just roughly what year are we in? How old is he roughly?
This is 2003, 2002 maybe. Yeah, 2002. I had adapted an Edith Wharton novel as the script, and my writing partner had done the music and lyrics, and we were finally taking it for an outing, having done a lot of just sort of 3-person readings, myself and my wife, Andrea, who's here tonight, and who's an actor. And so we finally decided to, like I said, do it informally. And when he grabbed us, the first thing he said was, "Okay, so what's next?" And I said, "Can you be more specific?" And he said, "Well, sure, I have a lot of questions. Do you?" And I was sort of swimming in overwhelm. First of all, having heard the first act of this monstrously long musical I had written, and so I was overwhelmed by that. But yeah, I had questions. And he said, "Well, you have to write them down immediately because you'll forget them before tomorrow. And they're the jumping off place for how you're going to start working tomorrow or the next day." And so he said, "So if you can, write them down right now." And so I did, and
so he meant questions about what you had
about
already
what I had already created. In the first act, we had a second act to go, right? And at that point, it was 3:30 in the morning after the first act. But then also my writing partner, the very next day, got a call from Steve and said, great, in that, like you said, that growl, that Guys and Dalzian growl, great, it was terrific. Can we meet? And they went out for lunch at the end of the week. We did our reading on a Tuesday, and on Friday they went out for lunch. And I can tell you, I had, throughout the reading, I had one eye on all the actors and sort of the fisheye on Sondheim, like, what are you thinking? And he was sipping wine and eating, hors d'oeuvres and stuff like that. He came to the meeting with my writing partner with 2 legal-sized, back and front pages of notes that he had gone home and taken the time to write out, and again, mostly questions, right, that he had for him. So like you said, he was constantly compelled to be a part of somebody else's process, and a bigger, participate in something larger than his, which was amazing, for which we're always grateful. Did you have any moments throughout your 3 years where you did have, I think Ontological Terror is going to be the name of my book about my relationship with Sondheim. Just Ontological Terror. Were there any moments where he would say something or reference something and go, oh, yeah, that's Stephen Sondheim?
Meaning like something from his work?
Or something, or just something, a point of view, or?
Well, I mean, it was all Sondheim. You know, he was utterly and completely himself from this voice. You know, it's funny. One of the points of the book was that the book is the experience, and my experience with him is the book. So, for instance, I draw in very little information that you could get somewhere else. You know, for instance, if you want to hear the story about, I don't know, like Katharine Hepburn banging on his door when he's writing Company, like, you know, that's a widely available story, and he may rehash it at one moment. Can't remember if he rehashes in the book or not, but as a result, like there were many moments I didn't really know. I mean, we were talking about look, he was 87, so almost everybody who he had collaborated with was gone. And many of them had gone 20, 30 years, right? So, for instance, they were names that, you know, they were important names in the theater. It wasn't that he was nostalgic, but that just happened to be the period where, a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum, previewed in New Haven, and George Firth, the famous, not George Firth, I'm sorry, who's the
George
guy?
Abbott.
Yeah, George Abbott, delivers a witticism, George Abbott was a famous sort of play doctor who if we were sitting here in 1970, besides worrying about our cars being stolen in Montclair, I think we would know immediately who George Abbott was. But a lot of the names I didn't know, and I wasn't pretending what I thought I was bringing to him. But he, again, like he's not. If he kept a journal, it's entirely possible, and I would simply accept it that, like, there was one small notation, November 23rd, 2017, pain in the ass from TNY, back again, hope to be done by 5 to go back to writing, or for dinner with real friends. I mean, that's the point is our relationship lived in an ambiguous terrain.
Yeah.
And I think he enjoyed that. I mean, I don't think that was a problem for him. I was very careful. So sometimes when you spend a lot of time with someone, you become their friend. And that has considerable awkwardness from the point of view of interviewing, right? But I don't think either of us wanted that. I think we both found it was actually a lot of fun to be the exact kind of friends that we were, which were people with a very tangled combination of professional interests, personalities, competition, because he was very competitive. There's a very amusing part in the book where we're with Meryl Streep at a dinner, and he keeps putting me down. And it's like, I mean, it reminded me of being in college when you like go out for burgers and like you're both interested in the same other person, and you're like suddenly putting in little jabs to make sure that this person thinks more highly of you. So anyway, I found that really perplexing and kind of, comic. I mean, just almost beyond understanding. It was so deep in him. The competitiveness was very, very deep in him, and in fact is deep in me, that it was fun. I would put him down in front of Meryl Streep. I understood that I would be, going home and walking the dog. Whereas, like, he had dog walkers, and Meryl Streep actually probably walks her own dog. But still, the point being that the separateness was part of the joy, I think, for both of them. He had friends. One of the things I speculated in the introduction, not a part I read, is that he was lonely. I don't think he was. I mean, I think he had an almost endless appetite for sociability once his work was done, which is, a very, very normal and common personality for a creative person, right? You can't get a hold of him until he's done with his work. But I don't think he was lonely. I mean, I don't think, there's an anecdote I tell in the story, in the book, because I'm working on a book on Mark Twain, and it's about Mark Twain, who at the end of his life founded a rather spooky group of sort of 15-year-old to 25-year-old girls called his Aquarium. with their mothers, and he used to basically like use them to tell jokes to, because he'd kind of run out. He was old. He'd kind of run out of friends. And at first I thought maybe that's what the role I, allowing for differences might be occupying. But no, he had friends. He went out to the theater all the time. He went to movies. He enjoyed pretty good physical health, and that obviously is just absolutely indispensable. He did have fibrillations, and there was one time when he canceled something because he had been ill that morning. But the main competitor for my affection, he was also in a very long-term relationship with a man whom he married shortly before his death. But I think the main competitor for me was the Buñuel musical. That was what every morning was given over to. He also had to do rewrites for the female-led company that some of you may have seen, which was so wonderful. But I really feel, when we talk about why did the relationship falter so often, on the one hand, I think it's sort of like, why does anything that you throw up in the sky come back down to the earth? Like most long profile relationships are difficult. I think there's a line in Finale where I say, the profile is a fraught form. Profiles of the famously fraught. Most of them hit rocks at some point, but with him it was constant. And the excuse that he used different excuses different times. But I think really in the end that, that he felt like, here I am spending a lot of time being interviewed by this guy who I find entertaining, and good company, but I'm a pro, right? I'm a pro. I'm an 87-year-old pro. Like, a pro doesn't do an interview without a show going on the board. Like, you do not spend your time, so he alleged that I had asked the leading question about Andrew Lloyd. You can see all this in the book, but that I had implied that he might have learned something from Andrew Lloyd Webber. That's one reason what are some of the others? I didn't put them all in. There were so many.
Yeah. That was deep.
Yeah, that was the one. But I think it was all because, he didn't want to be foolish, and it would be foolish to have a profile run if you're Stephen Sondheim without something that people had to go and see. Like, one of many reasons he stopped was there was a very brief piece by Lin-Manuel Miranda in the T part of the New York Times Magazine while I was working on this, and he wrote that it was a very pleasant, admiring piece. Miranda really considered himself, as you saw from the introduction, almost his son, but it was not what he wanted. He didn't want to be a guy who was profiled without something, quote, to sell. And he respected the selling of things. He was a theater guy. That was one of the things that was fun. Maybe why he was sort of accessible was that he always felt like if you grew too big in the theater, you just lost it. You didn't become something better. You just lost it. You just were nothing.
Yeah, it was interesting that, again, it was one of the places I circled, that it was in one interview where you brought up him having seen something by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and you said, did you learn anything from that? And he sort of is gray in his answer, but it's not until toward the end of your last interview where he calls it back and says, and you said that thing about Andrew Lloyd Webber, and was there anything to learn from him? And it was really remarkable to me that he carried it. It was months later.
Yeah, well, this comes under the comic book heading DT steps and shit twice. So first I asked him sincerely, well, let's put it this way. First I asked him what do you think of Andrew Lloyd Webber, and his little antennae went up.
Yep.
Slowly, because it wasn't, and he thought he was being kind of, wrong-footed into saying something which, I don't know, the New York Post, I'm not quite sure where he thought that would go in 2017,
He was worried, yeah.
He was, but what is it, Sondheim to Weber dropped dead? It just doesn't really make sense. These weren't names that lived in that world anymore. I'm sure it would have been a good BroadwayWorld.com scandal, but it was small.
Yeah.
But then I told him the truth, so this is the second step I take. I said, no, what I really wanted to know was, did you learn anything? I was hoping what you'd say was, the way that, Andy, Sir Andrew, handles the diminished fifth in Sunset Boulevard 3 minutes before the end of the first act taught me, what I later used in Bounce. I don't know, right? So that turned out to be a far, far worse insult to him
Oh, yeah.
than saying to him, like, what do you think of the guy? Like, he would much rather be, you know, lured into a pissing contest than for me to suggest that he actually could learn something from a hack like Weber.
Yeah.
So, you know, and it's true, he does bring that back later. But again, I think if the Buñuel had been, you know, there's a moment I care about deeply in the book because, you know, I do like to nurture in interviews, and it's not the easiest thing to do, but I do. I don't go to do this to make somebody uncomfortable. There's a moment where I meet with him in Connecticut, and he's talking about how badly the day's writing went, and I say to him something like, you know, if you'd had a good day, you know, you'd be feeling like, I can't wait to get back to the work and everything's perfect. Because he was saying, you know, no one wants my musicals, no one wants me, you know, and I'm really glad I got that out. I mean, I'm sure he had 1 million people saying it to him every day, from his husband on, you know, but I just was really pleased that I, for a moment, got to play that role. Because, I mean, I do think he was in some ways, I wouldn't say suffering, but I would say suffering.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I think,
That's the way.
you know, there's a line in the book also where I say, you know, I felt bad that all this weight, that we were all so dependent on him. So it's not just those literally dependent on him, the actors who could be in the musical, David Ives, the book writer, you know, the public theater which was going to produce it, the critics who would get to get front page coverage because it was a new Sondheim musical that they could trash. But it was us, it was this whole room, it was everyone who had their Sondheim moments, you know, and it's the nature of having a moment like that, you know, you wouldn't much mind another moment like that, and even better if it's brand new. I mean, just look at the response Company, these retreads of Company Into the Woods. I don't know if you've been, I mean, they're both really good.
Yeah.
But the audience is just crazy,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm sure if he were alive, and it's hard to be thinking, like, where were you in 1973?
Yeah.
Well, you talk about that in your, I think it's in your introduction, which I found fascinating, which you said, the younger generation has a perspective of these musicals that speak to them more than when they were done originally. Can you talk a little bit about what you say about that and why you think that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this doesn't quite include, you know, the fact that, you know, most musicals on Broadway are not very complicated. I mean, it's, you know, and that probably Sondheim remains a minority taste, but I think he's a majority minority taste. And I suppose the reason is if you go and see Company today, you know, it's not really that different from a really good Netflix show in terms of how the interiority of the people is a little bit complicated. Nothing has to be totally spelled out. You know, people have mixed motives and everything they do. And compare it to the sitcoms that I grew up on network television. I mean, if you took like even a sitcom as good as All in the Family and compared it to Company, like the difference would be so stark. Whereas if you take any number of, you know, current shows, I'm trying to think of one that, I can't remember. Give me a, Flora, what's the show we watch? What's the show we watch?
Which one?
You know, the one with the young woman who's in London. It removes the fourth wall all the time.
Fleabag?
Oh, Fleabag.
Fleabag. Yes, you're right. Yeah.
So I mean, Fleabag is like a Sondheim musical. I mean, I think, I mean, you know, I don't know if he probably didn't know the show. I don't know if he, I mean, but one can imagine he could have enjoyed it. And so I just think the culture made a much bigger, you know, upper middle brow place for what Sondheim was doing.
Yeah.
And then again, you know, kids do the shows all the time. I mean, the first act of Into the Woods is a rite of passage for talented young, maybe not that talented young singers. Every high school from Montclair to, you know, Claremont,
And
California.
college.
I mean, it's just, right? It's just, and it's terrific, and they love it. So, you know, people have also bitten off pieces of Sondheim. I didn't know where this left him creatively, though. I mean, that's the part that I don't really... So remember, there's a key moment in the story, I feel, when he really talks about how we're in Connecticut. This is actually just before the Andrew Lloyd Webber double misstep. But he, you know, I don't know if this mattered to you when you read it, but it mattered to me a lot when I experienced it, which is he talks about being out of date.
Yeah.
And, you know, so when a creative person talks that way, it can mean anything. It could just mean, like, you know, it could just mean, I don't really think that, but I just need a, you know, a little hug, right? I felt like no hug was going to restore. He was so good that if he couldn't solve the problem of being essentially a 1940s, 50s creative person in the modern era, then really there was nothing that I could say. So now the only thing that doesn't make sense to me about that, so he was basically saying, music has passed me by. I love harmony. There's no harmony in rock. I'm sure if the things he saw on Broadway that bothered him were musical like Frozen, that kind of thing. So where did that leave him? And the thing that doesn't totally make sense to me is, he had survived rock, right? I mean, he's a guy who was comfortable on the Ed Sullivan Show. I mean, he was that guy, right? In fact, it was actually Oscar Hammerstein was that guy. Oscar Hammerstein was on the Ed Sullivan Show more than any other person.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Hands hit. So anyway, but Sondheim was on it, or Jack Parr. I mean, he was a creature of that wonderful period with the skinny ties and this funny moment where television doesn't know it's going to become a truly mass medium and is still trying to absorb some of the energy of Broadway in New York City. You know what I mean? But so he survives rock. I mean, he survives when his whole world is just knocked on its ass. Like, it's just gone. Like, nobody's doing what he's doing except 15 people in the West 40s, But he survives that. I mean, creatively. I just don't mean, because it's true, he gets knocked out of Broadway to off-Broadway, but he finds his footing. Yeah.
He even uses rap, or his version of rap in Into the Woods, and Lynn talks about that.
And uses the word rap. What is it, rap? What's the word for the English vegetable that he uses?
Oh, rampion.
Yeah, rampion.
Yeah, rampion, yeah.
Ripping
So
up my rampions.
in Into the Woods, the witch has a sort of a stream of consciousness that is his version of rap, and even Lynn Miranda talks about, like, that was the first time I'd heard something even close to what I had been listening to in pop music. So, and that was, mid to late 80s.
But it's kind of a one-off, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, what he loved was, No More Questions.
Yeah.
I mean, that beautiful melody with that complicated harmony under it. I mean, I think that's the stuff that and the puns. You love the puns.
Yes.
I mean, honestly, who else would kind of kill a brilliant song with the last line, the end justifies the beans. I mean, groan.
But then what's interesting is he builds it so well that you don't groan when you hear it,
don't
right?
groan.
Like because
But
it's
your
so
jaw
character-centric.
But your jaw is a little...
Did that just happen?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, because it's just, I don't know. He and I, so one of the other subtexts of the book is that we compete over rhymes. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I actually wasn't... You'll read the book and you'll think, did he really think he could outrhyme Sondheim? And it's actually an interesting question because Sondheim was very strict in his rhymes. Yeah. And I think that's because I actually talked about this with a couple of people. I was like, so famously Sondheim used a rhyming dictionary. No one can believe he used a rhyming dictionary. Initially, I thought he used a rhyming dictionary to find rhymes. But I actually think he used a rhyming dictionary the way people use, a book on good English grammar in order not to make mistakes. So in other words, if it wasn't in the rhyming dictionary, he discarded it. He didn't want to challenge rhyme. Rhyme was the box, and harmony was the challenge for him. So rhyme had to be stable and fixed. Now first of all, I wasn't a composer at all, but I thought, so we did a Purim play.
Yeah.
About this. We've been in so many synagogues. Which synagogue were we in when we did that? Oh, we were in the Montclair Jewish Workshop, and we did a Purim play, and I was given one of the songs from Hamilton, and I did a rhyme, and I rhymed. The jokes were the same every year, but I rhymed babka with vodka. An obvious joke. Anyway, and I trotted it out for Sondheim, and he just looked at me and he was like, "Wow, if you want to waste waste your time on off rhymes, that's your business.
Yeah.
But don't go around saying you're rhyming. And so,
But also, what I loved about that is, yeah, he was like, if you like off rhymes, that's fine. And
Yeah.
you're like, why? You know, isn't it fun? And he's like, well, if your idea of fun is singing off key,
yeah.
and he really equated it to being off pitch, to
Right.
having off
Which
rhyme.
was interesting, right?
Amazing.
Now, what I don't understand, so there's very few things I regret not saying in our conversation, because the conversation was complicated enough. But I always wished I challenged him on what I've always considered that the opening of Sweeney Todd is one of the worst rhymes, you know, in any piece of, any brilliant work. And maybe there's somebody here who explains it better than me, but this line about, you know, attend the tale of Sweeney Todd, something, something, and his eye was odd, right? That seems to me the exact thing he hated most in the world. It's a forced rhyme with no meaning. The guy's eye is not particularly odd. I think God would have been a better line. You feared no God. Right? And I wish I just said that to Sondheim. You'd call him Steve. I don't. I'm like, why didn't you? You know, that's the better rhyme. And I've been curious because, you know, he never, the only time I mentioned an off rhyme, he got me. It was on some moment from Bounce, and it turned out the guy was under the influence of hallucinogens, and that's why he does an off rhyme. So it was very clever on his part. Totally got me.
That's amazing.
But what would he have said to that?
I can't speak for him, but in my investigation of it, it's, first of all, it's to me, it's a perfect rhyme because one is a name, and the other one is a description, and his eye was odd because the moment he shows up on stage, he's looking for who wronged him. Right, so it's not about like he's walking around like a pirate maiden, you know, like, I'm very pale, I've got this odd eye. No, the moment he shows, he's literally foreshadowing how a character is going. It's what I tell my students, is if you're reading the lyric correctly, you're going to know what your motivation and your intention is. And you can do that with, I would say, 95% of Stephen Sondheim's lyrics. If you study his lyrics from an acting point of view, he is telling you what is expected, what you are obliged to do and act and express. And when you hear his skin was pale and his eye was odd, from the moment, especially in that original, Len Cariou, who just, you know, the moment he showed up, your skin crawled. It's all about that the minute he shows up, he's looking at everybody, including the audience, and going, did you do it? Did you take my wife away? Do I have to get even with you? And the moment, and because it's such a simple rhyme, I think is what sets up the drama. Is that it first of all, it's very fable-like, you know, he's setting up a Penny Dreadful. So he's sort of flipping the pages going, come on, lean in, this guy's weird, right? So it's a very simple description. But what it is fathoms deep about this man we're going to meet throughout the play.
It's a good answer.
Thanks.
I'm kind of glad I didn't bring it up. I hadn't really thought about it that deeply.
Yeah. Well, he goes, you know, and so this leads me to something I wanted to ask you too. One thing that Steve says to you in the book is that any good piece of art is surprising but inevitable, and I loved that phrase. That any good piece of art has something that is surprising but inevitable, and so I mentioned it there because what he's doing is laying a very simple storyline about a man that's just going to go. That odd eye is going to lead to his demise, right? If you follow the story correctly. Or thoroughly. The reason it was interesting to me is also your experience with him, where after these almost 3.5 years, very quickly, finally he says, so no, we're not going to do this anymore. Was that surprising but inevitable for you? Did you see any hint
Like
of
art?
You know, like a good piece of art?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, so it's true. So at the end, he says something very memorable. He says,
Yeah.
I don't want to be looked at.
Yeah.
I think really, I mean, I'll take a very practical view. I think if the Buñuel had been going well again, he would have reached out to me. I mean, I think a lot of it had to do with the idea he'd never get that play done, that musical done. I mean, I think there was a book written by David Ives. He had, Sondheim had done a first act of songs. I don't think he was all that thrilled with them, although I don't know for sure. He was starting out on the second act songs. At one point in my story, he says he knows where they go. Well, that's not insignificant. So I really feel that everything would have been trumped by the sense that he was on his way to something And, you know, he also would have probably consulted with his friends. You know, he wasn't alone
Yeah.
in this. You know, I mean, in a sense, we were in our conversations because there was this long period of time where, you know, at one point, so when I start with him, the public theater has the option on the Buñuel and is, you know, essentially waiting to put it on. And then I think at some point, from what I understand, Sondheim sort of said to the people, the public, you know, it's just not happening. And they were like, okay, you know, well, if it happens again, you know, give us a call. And then he continued working on it. And again, because this book is very deliberately circumscribed, I don't know whether we'll one day see part of it, most of it. I don't know if right now somebody who's very good but not Sondheim is finishing it. I mean, you know, there's commercial considerations, there's whatever Sondheim wished for, there's the questions about what the estate wants, but I mean, it's an intense moment when I, you know, see, I don't know whether he's working well before I come into this stage set. It always looks like somebody's working well when you walk into this townhouse with, you know, a person who goes through the swinging doors. I mean, she wasn't quite in livery, but practically she was, and she'd been his person for 50 years, and everyone knew her name except me. And then he had an assistant upstairs he had a musicologist upstairs, and then he also had a personal assistant upstairs, and it all flowed through the room. And so it was very hard to imagine that nothing was happening. But I do think that was very important in that moment, which is, so in the fifth of the 5 encounters, there's probably I have to say the sort of the sourest moment where he really pushes away. And I mean, this isn't in the book, but I mean, I did feel afterward, like I remember going back out onto East 49th or 47th, whatever street it was, and really thinking, that was unpleasant.
Yeah.
I actually had a friend coming who met me, and the friend, I had learned by then, you know, that Sondheim was competitive, and so I had someone come who I thought he would find interesting and appealing, and immediately he started like playing us off against each other. He's like, I really enjoyed this, and I said, you did? And he said, no, I was talking to her. So it put us in an okay place without actually really healing. But again, I mean, you can, the experience was real, but it was also not real. I mean, that's part of what I think makes Finale an interesting book. There will be books from his friends, and they'll have the usual problem that books from people's friends have, which is, you know, you can't say everything. I mean, you can't. Like, no person, you know, there may be a book, I'm trying to think of who's the most likely candidate. They may have already written books and passed away. I mean, he's in, well, okay, so there's this wonderful Mary Rogers book that was just published posthumously, and I hope that Margaret has a couple of copies up front, because I'll sign them too. But anyway, so, and that's a book that tells revealing stories about Steve or Sondheim, and there may be more. I mean, that's a weird one because she died some years ago, and yet this book mysteriously only came out recently. I don't know the story of where. Do you know where it was?
I don't know. It was very surprising.
I mean,
Yeah, I do.
Oh yeah, what's the story?
The family. It's her family.
Mary Rogers said they did not want to publish?
No, the family did.
Oh, they did want to publish?
Yes.
But what was it doing for the 12
It was
years?
just sitting around.
Oh, okay. But did they publish
And
it?
well, I know from one of the relatives that they think 98% is absolutely true. So.
Not that much. Depends which 2% she made. I think, should we throw it to questions? Since
Yeah,
I think
please.
we're moving into that zone.
So you approached him, Steve Sondheim, about a profile. When did it become a book?
Well, all right. So you know, he died. I didn't know he was ill, and in a way, he wasn't really ill. So we were all surprised, and a couple of people said, "How can you be surprised when somebody who's 91 years old passes away?" But we were all surprised. And so I had all these interviews, and I knew that they were unusual and interesting. But they'd been a while ago, and it was really hard for me to know what their texture was. And then the New Yorker wanted to do a section on the website. We had a new digital issue. I don't know if you're subscribers, but one week you didn't get a real issue, you got a digital issue. Sorry. you can put it in the recycling when you're done too. But after that, so that got a big response, and it got a big response from his friends, which surprised me. People who really knew him, and I thought, maybe maybe there's something here that was interesting to more than just me. So I pulled out the material. There was an editor who grew interested, the book editor, very, very capable guy named John Zhao, but I wasn't sure I wanted to do anything, and because when you're done, you're usually done with what I do. I do a lot of features. I can't think of, they very rarely do you want to do more. It's a long experience. I think I was saying to somebody, or maybe we even said it here already, that I might have had to see him 10 times to do profile. So I don't think I'm halfway. But I looked at it, and I felt like there was life. I've always been fond of a funny form of book that's now completely gone called table talk. There used to be table talk books with great people, like Table Talk with Robert Louis Stevenson. And these books had no exact form. But, in the days before there was TV and movies and you could see someone forever, Facebook, they were the closest you could get to a person who had died, who'd been a remarkable mind. And so a little bit me thought, let's do a table talk here. And then I also grew interested in, let's say, a little bit of the trade craft of what I was doing, which I've always thought there's about 8 people that write long feature pieces for magazines like The New Yorker, so it's not like anyone's desperate to know what I do. But I still find that relationship interesting, and I felt it particularly interesting with Sondheim for all the reasons that we talked about earlier here. And so I thought, and then I pulled out the pieces, and I saw it made a kind of a play, obviously, enough, and it had an ending where the audience would kind of gasp, and it had a kind of nice middle where you could go and get, buy one of the overpriced tchotchkes out in the lobby if you wanted to, and it just kind of appealed to me, and so, I think primarily, honestly, it was that people who knew him were like, whoa, you really caught him. No one ever really caught him before. And I was like, really? Well, guess I caught him. I think 5 interviews is a lot. Probably not, it's not normal. It's not normal to get 5 interviews with somebody before you even start writing a word. As I say, I felt I was sort of halfway there. We've been to his summer house. We've been to his house. I don't know. I'd never been to his favorite restaurant. Did you know what his favorite restaurant was?
No.
What did he like? Did he have a haunt? He'd been on that street for so long.
He's very close with Judy Prince, with Hal Prince as well.
Yeah.
They were best friends, and so I would think they had their Upper East Side haunts, but I don't know.
Yeah.
And Hal Prince died during, that was one of the other things. Hal Prince dies during the time that I'm working on the profile. Would he have been the last of the peers, the last of that group before Steve?
I would think
Yeah.
so.
Is there anyone else?
Except for
Anyone
Judy,
just?
because he was incredibly.
No, I think he and Hal and Judy were familial. They were
Right.
filial with each other. I'd say as far as peers go, Sheldon Harnick is still with us, and
Oh, really?
so I think and so I think of that, but I don't think they were particularly close. But as far as somebody,
Good thing I
who's
didn't bring him up,
close to
right?
me. Yeah.
Actually, I do bring him up.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
You absolutely do. Yeah.
They're we're at this gala, and they're playing Fiddler on the Roof tunes, even though Sondheim's the honoree. Like in the warm-up, and he says, this is just in, something that, he's like, Harnick and Bach have been blacklisted. I actually wrote Fiddler on the Roof. But he doesn't, immediately after he shifts voices and he goes, no, they're just playing hits.
Yeah.
I don't think he wanted me to think he'd written Fiddler on the Roof for more than a second.
just for a minute. Both Andre and Priscilla's remind me. Jonathan Tunick, the orchestrator, would be
okay.
somebody that would be very close. And then to that end, Paul Gimignani, I think as well.
And
Yeah.
Mary Rogers.
Right, of course.
In that book in Shot.
Yeah.
She was in love with him.
Yeah. Gemignani is younger though.
Yes.
Much younger. But I meant more
but
that group,
Yeah.
the group of names. They're just,
George Firth, too.
Yeah.
But he died long
He
ago.
passed away.
Yeah.
Just thinking who's alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was saying who remains.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jonathan is from.
Yes.
An anecdote and then a comment. You know they had the same birthday.
Yes. Andrew Lloyd Webber and Stephen Sondheim.
And there's an anecdote there that
Yes.
they met at a performance of Evita, And Andrew said to Steve, "Why do people take an instant dislike to me?" And he said, "It saves time." It sounds apocryphal, but with his wit.
Exactly. We'll
But
take it.
I just wanted to say,
that is awful.
I haven't read your book yet, but I've read Merrill's and all the others, and I hope somewhere along the lines people acknowledge the influence of the computer community, because while you were reaching out to him, I was too, as a non-journalist. We had a CompuServe group, and we became Sondheimians, and that led to Sondheim.com, the Sondheim Review, and the Stephen Sondheim Society over in London.
Yeah.
And it was really in that time that Steve became much more, because originally, like when I wrote to him the first time, he said no interviews.
Yeah.
He said, "Write me in 6 months," and I did it again, and eventually he
Yeah.
gave it in. But that there's nothing even in the Sondheim Encyclopedia about that.
Yeah.
And I hope if it has another edition.
Well, you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, he said
Yeah.
to me at some point, he says, we're talking about like great inventions, and one of the great inventions for him that changed the world was Word. And then he also says that if he were born again, he'd been born as a computer programmer.
Yeah,
That he loved it, because he was a math guy.
yeah.
At some point he was a math guy.
Yeah.
It must have been very early.
Yeah.
Because at Williams,
Back at
he's
William-
not. Is he doing math at Williams? Or is he?
To start, and then he
Oh, really?
finds music. Yeah.
But and then this isn't nearly as good as your anecdote, but one of the weird truths is that Tom Lear, the composer, lyricist, more jokier tone, but is a mathematician, professional mathematician, and it was at MIT when he retired. And he and Sondheim, weirdly enough, went to summer camp together.
Wow.
So can you imagine, like,
I know exactly.
the lyrics in that talent show?
Exactly. Amazing.
Yeah.
Is it- Yeah. One more question. Anybody have anything? Yes, Liam.
On the topic of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Stephen Sondheim, did you guys ever talk about their South Park episode where they were stars together?
No, see, I didn't. I mean, I knew that Sondheim had. There's an episode of Sondheim in South Park, right? Is
Right,
it just
yes.
one? I didn't realize Andrew Lloyd Webber is part of that.
Yeah,
as
and
well.
another composer, I forget who.
And what do they do?
I don't think I can talk about it.
No, I mean,
What a great way to wrap up.
I think he knew about all this stuff. I mean, what's interesting you bring up, it's true that he was, he was. I wouldn't say like I don't know. He put down Facebook, which I thought was interesting. He said, I don't need any more friends.
Yeah.
I don't want a friend. I don't want to be friended. But that was a slightly different thing. He liked, he wasn't uninterested in the modern world. He wasn't, somebody who, I think his big wish, and he actually states this at that moment when he's talking about being out of date, I said to him, it's we have this relationship, and at some point there's a kind of funny equality to the relationship, which is not real, but exists within the particular way that he lived his life and so on. And anyway, he says, I'm out of date. He says I'm old-fashioned shit. Like he says, my father used to listen to Victor Herbert operettas, and I used to make fun of him, and now I'm the Victor Herbert operetta.
Yeah.
And I said to him, I just don't think that's true. I mean, you're a genius. And so I kind of stumbled over the word because I didn't know that would be anything he'd particularly want to hear for a lot of different reasons. One, because he'd heard it since he was 12. Two, because it puts more pressure on him. And three, because it makes you kind of a fanboy. But I said it. And there was a kind of a moment of pause. And then he sort of said, thank you for the word. And he kind of made a salam-type gesture. But then he got to the point. He said, real geniuses. So he's distinguishing between geniuses, which he would acknowledge himself to be, and I think I would. I got no problem with that at all. But real geniuses, he said, and he named Stravinsky, Picasso, and one other. Gershwin, interestingly. Although Gershwin really never lived long enough for us to know what he would have done. But anyway, he said real geniuses are able to take everything that's in the culture, everything that's new, and absorb it into their work. And I can't do that. I'm still stuck, he says or implies, in like that era where people wrote songs. And I think that was the big weight on his back. It wasn't. I don't think it was age exactly. I just think if you're, to put yourself to do what he had to do, you had to feel that you were not just creating a show for people who love Sondheim or for singers. You have to feel like you're a key component of the culture.
Yes,
And he just couldn't make that argument anymore, and I think it really weighed on him.
I agree. Yeah. So, as we wrap up, I'll say at Mr. Sondheim's memorial, Anna Quinlan, the writer, said something that a lot of people found moving, which was she said, I will always have his music. I have Spotify. I can listen to it any time. I will always know that part of him. I will miss the guy. I'll miss the person. And I mention it because, honest to goodness, when I read your book, I thought that's what I'm getting out of your interview and your portrayal of him was, oh, this is the guy. This is the guy that hangs out and talks and spars and makes jokes and gets simple with people. And it really was just, for me, the through line through your entire book. And I thought it was just terrific. So thank you for this time. Thank you for joining us this evening.